The appeal to rules method. People often take the view that one must sometimes ignore the consequences of an action and simply assess the morality of the action itself. It is generally accepted that some things are simply wrong, even if they might bring about good consequences. It's also accepted that people should not do such things. As the saying goes, that's just not right. It is also generally accepted that some things are acceptable or right, even if they might have harmful consequences. It's also accepted that people should be allowed to do such things. Now, this method itself involves assessing an action, policy, etc., in terms of the nature of the action, policy, etc. itself, as opposed to its consequences or effects. The theoretical basis for this is what is known as rule deontology. This is the view that morality is based on determining and following the correct moral rules. Immanuel Kant is perhaps the best known deontologist. We'll look at him in the part on moral theory. Religious ethics also tends to be rule deontological in nature. For example, the Ten Commandments provide a set of rules that are supposed to be followed without exception. Don't lie, don't kill, don't steal, don't get caught. Now, while rule deontological theories often have a great deal of appeal, they're also subject to debate and criticism, like all theories and approaches. While this method refers to rules, it is important not to confuse moral rules with other types of rules, such as those of civil law, or criminal law, or rules of a university, or rules of a club, or rules of a game. There are theories that do involve the claim that morality is determined by the law of the state. For example, there's a view known as legal positivism. It's the view that morality is determined by the laws of the state. Thomas Hobbes is often considered to be a legal positivist. The aptly named Chinese legalist also held this view. It is, of course, possible to argue from legal rules or religious rules to a moral rule. This is discussed in a later method, the one known as mixing norms. Now, just like with law, it's also important not to confuse religious rules with moral rules. Well, people often assume that what is a rule in their religion is therefore automatically a moral rule. Logically, this doesn't follow automatically. There are, however, moral theories, such as divine command theory, in which what is a religious rule is automatically a moral rule. And of course, the method previously mentioned, mixing norms, can be used to make a legitimate transition from religion to ethics. Now, the method itself, appeal to rules, comes in two basic forms. The first method is this. Step 1. Argue that X violates or does not violate moral rule Y. Step 2. Conclude that X is morally unacceptable, or, if it doesn't violate the rule, is morally acceptable. Method 2 is this. Argue that X is required by moral rule Y. Step 2. Conclude that X is morally obligatory. In other words, one must do it. Now, the most difficult part of these methods is the first step. The challenge is to argue in favor of a moral rule and show how something breaks this rule, or follows the rule, or is required by the rule. One way to do this is to use an already established moral theory or principle. For example, one may make an argument against lying by using the religious commandment against being a false witness, and use divine command theory to make the transition from religion to morality. People often make appeals from legal rules, such as the American Bill of Rights, in making moral arguments. For example, moral arguments about censorship in the United States almost inevitably involve an appeal to the legal right outlined in the First Amendment. However, to make a proper moral argument requires showing that the legal right of the First Amendment supports a moral right to free speech. Mixing norms, which will be discussed later, is a very useful way of doing this. Now suppose you're on the receiving end of an appeal to rules, or, in the context of the paper, you use the appeal to rules, and now you're going to raise an objection against your own appeal to rules. So what are the methods of responding to this method? Now there are two main ways to counter this method. The first is that the rule used can be attacked. If the rule is successfully attacked, then the argument is undercut. This type of attack varies, depending on the rule and the circumstances. It can be argued that the rule is illegitimate. For example, someone might attack an argument based on a religious rule by arguing that the rule is mistaken or no longer applies today. It can also be argued that a more important rule overrides the rule. For example, it could be argued that a rule about lying might be breakable because the rule of saving someone's life is more important, thus allowing a person to lie to save a life. The second main avenue of reply is to argue that some factor other than moral rules should be used when assessing the situation. This can be done by using another method, such as the appeal to consequences, to offer a counter-argument. For example, someone might argue that while it is surely not a pleasant thing to contemplate or do, those with incurable contagious diseases should be mercifully put to death. This would effectively reduce the spread of contagious disease, protecting everyone else from them. And of course, the stock slogan that the good of the many must outweigh the needs of the few can be developed in an argument, especially when it comes to life and death. And that brings us to the end of the appeal to rules.